Okay, Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you for being here. We're going to go ahead and get started. Dr. Rania, if you want to introduce the first speaker.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. We're really happy to have all of you here for this wonderful panel on integrating Islamic psychology. MashaAllah, we're really blessed to have a very vibrant panel. Inshallah, today we're going to begin with Dr. Rabia Malik, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about her. And the way we're going to do this is we're going to have each of our presenters present their presentation, and at the end we're going to have Q&A. I do ask that all the participants go ahead and start putting their Q&A in the chat box. You can write that to me. Actually, just write it in the chat box, and I'll keep track of them. So at the very end here, we can have a good discussion between all of the panelists, inshallah. So our first, inshallah, panelist today is Dr. Rabia Malik. She is a consultant systemic therapist who has extensive experience working with Muslim clients and communities in the UK. Her work has focused on developing culturally and religiously integrated therapeutic practice. She's also the co-lead of a specialist mental health service in London, the Marble Cultural Therapy Center, and a senior lecturer at the University of East London. Currently, she teaches professional doctorate students at the Tavistock Center, sorry, Dr. Rabia, if that came out wrong, and works also freelance providing trainings for therapy. She's written several papers on Muslims and mental health and Islamically integrated therapy, and her doctoral research was on the cultural construction of depression amongst Pakistanis. So Dr. Rabia, we're so happy to have you with us. Please join us.
Thank you so much. And you know, alhamdulillah, it's a real blessing this conference has gone ahead, and I'm so grateful to have this opportunity to share with colleagues thinking and the development of this field. So my talk's going to be really focusing on practice because I'm just going to try and get my slides up too. Akila, can you let me share my screen?
Yep, you should be able to. Hamad, have you made her
yeah, you're good. You're good now.
Yep.
You're good.
Yep.
Okay. Just 1 second. Okay, so my talk is on developing Islamic therapeutic interventions. And I'll just say a little bit about how I came to this to start with. I trained as a systemic therapist, and I had really developed through my doctoral research an interest in cultural beliefs around the construction of mental illness. And I'd realized that underlying that was an Islamic philosophy or worldview. And I was then lucky enough to be employed in a service that specifically asked for me to try and promote that cultural and religious thinking and to develop ways of working that would engage with these communities, which at the time weren't really accessing mental health services. This is going back a long time now. But because of my own personal interest in Islam and spirituality, I had around the same time started seeking more knowledge, Islamic knowledge, and had many questions, and was lucky enough to meet some scholars who really have helped me in my personal spiritual development, but also in the course of studying with them, I also found these incredible resources and gems and potential for things that could be used therapeutically and in a healing way with clients. And then because I was doing this job in this clinic, whilst I was studying with them, I could then try and integrate some of those ideas into my practice. And really it's been experimental and intuitive, so it's been quite a bottom-up approach, but it is something that I have been writing about more now. And all along I've been discussing with scholars. So I've really found my interaction with scholars to be incredibly constructive. The people that I have met and their knowledge of the human condition has just been profound and way beyond that of many therapists that I trained with. And also it's been a really dialectical process because of my personal relationship with them. I've applied ideas and then I've sometimes gone back to them for case consultation and described to them my work and got further input. And this kind of sharing of knowledge has been incredibly enriching for me, and something I've also received a lot of encouragement from them on. So just as a background, I mean, Abdallah gave an overview of an Islamic ontologically rooted approach to the self. you know, one of the main differences, I think, in the Islamic ontological approach, or any spiritual approach really, is that there's an emphasis on God as being the source and cause of all healing. And this is really highlighted in a paper by Azrullah, in which they argue that, you know, this is, for an approach to be ontologically Islamic, it really has to start from that premise. And I think using Quranic stories does that. Now, you know, Ambarhaq, who we heard from earlier, and others have argued that, you know, one of the areas that's really lacking in this field is the development of practice and ways of actually putting these ideas into practice for clients. And through my work with Quranic stories and also using the divine attributes of Allah, I've tried to integrate Islamic spirituality with meeting the mental health needs of Muslim clients. I should say, actually, from the start, I'm not going to focus so much on the divine attributes. I'll briefly mention it in this particular case, but that's because there's so little time for me to really do justice to it, and so I will focus on the Quranic stories. Now, this paper by Arazullah on Islamic ontology points out a research study that was done by Padella et al. Actually in America. And they found that American Muslims were seeking traditional healing practices alongside mainstream healing. And the kinds of practices that they were engaged in is what they called Islamic religious text-based practices. And I think the Quran is a very good example of that. Islamic worship practices and folk healing practices. And they argued that this is significant because according to the Islamic ontological and metaphysical point of view, where healing is from God, it becomes really important and meaningful for clients to feel that they're trying to attract God's divine attention into the healing process. So it's encouraging people really to call on God. And so they, along with others, argue that we really need a biopsychosocial spiritual approach to healing if we really want it to address the whole of the person. Now, the Quran, I mean, there's so much to say about it, but just very briefly, I mean, the Quran describes itself in many different ways as Quran al-Mubin, Quran al-Hakim, healing for what is inside the breasts. And you know, that alone in itself is really worth pondering on, that the Quran describes itself in these ways. And it's a sacred scripture, unlike man-made text. And it's really important for us to be aware of that. I mean, I think Muslims are aware of that, and they use the Quran in healing in many different ways. It is the kalam and the word of God. Now, for the main part of my paper, I'm actually going to describe a case study of some work that I did with somebody who I actually do supervision with. And I'm going to tell their story because I think this is a way of highlighting how I use these ideas in practice. I have the permission of my student, and I've disguised parts of the story so that hopefully it's not recognizable. So Zainab was a young Iraqi woman who I had been seeing for some time for supervision. During one of our sessions, she had asked me for a consultation about her personal therapy. She had been seeing a white male psychoanalyst for some time for her own development, but felt really stuck with him and that they had reached an impasse. She felt that he kept bringing things back to her relationship with her mother and implying that she must be angry with her. She felt put on the spot and didn't agree with him that she was angry with her mom. She said, "I feel like therapy is making me unhappy when I'm not." Her family history involved an unhappy relationship between her parents. Her mother had left when she was 9 years old, but had soon come back. But then she left again when Zainab was 18 years old, and soon after she had remarried another man. Zainab had felt abandoned by her mom and shamed in her extended family and community by what her mother had done, as people implied that she had had an affair. Her father never spoke about what happened, and neither did she with her older sisters. They all coped by themselves, and she had grown up feeling so alone as well as ashamed. She felt her mother had never thought about them, and since then, although they remained in contact, they had an emotionally distant relationship. I said perhaps her therapist didn't understand that in many Muslim collectivist cultures, it can be hard to be critical of one's parents, especially our mothers, because of the hadith that heaven lies below a mother's feet. I told her how I had seen many clients who struggled with this, and I had come to realize that whilst the relationship with our mothers is much revered, often people forget that there is not just a respect that is accorded to the mother by children, but also there comes a great responsibility with it. I had seen that whilst mothers bear much hardship for their children and deserve great respect, they can also crush and hurt their children. I said we can be angry with our mothers and still love them. Our mothers are human and imperfect. This seemed to resonate with Zainab and helped her open up. She said her therapist didn't understand the betrayal and shame she felt because of what people would say about her mother and how it was perceived in that cultural context. But strangely, her mother had actually never felt she'd made a mistake. Zainab had felt all the shame and had just wanted the earth to swallow her up at times. This talk of mistakes made me think about the story of Adam and Ebleese, and I shared with her that it had always struck me that it is not just Ebleese that makes a mistake, but also Adam. Both went against God's command, but the difference was that Adam does tawbah and turns to God. He and Hawa acknowledged that they wronged themselves and asked for God's forgiveness. Zainab started crying and said, "The way you understand, it helps. There is repentance." She said it is so hard to let these things out when it comes to people with authority. It is missing in my therapist who doesn't talk to me about God or my relationship with God, and it is missing in the imam who you feel ashamed telling these things to and worry that he will judge you and your family. I said, God is so forgiving. He knows how the human is. When the angels question God about why you have made man who will cause mischief on the earth, he says, I know what you know not. I said, God forgives us again and again. Zainab told me she was going to Iraq in a couple of weeks and was afraid of how she would be with her mother when she saw her now that this had all come up. I said, what would you want to say to her? She said, I want to tell her what we have never been able to tell our parents, about the damage they did to us. They feel like they suffered and ruined their lives, but they don't see what they did to us. Her mother thought she had sacrificed her life by waiting until Zainab was 18 to remarry. But Zainab lamented, how do I tell her it was hard for us too, how much I missed her and cried for her. I suggested we try it out and do a role play as if I was her mother and she could tell me what she wanted to say to her and I would try and feel and respond as her mother. I find this technique can be very useful for enabling clients to experience using their voice and experiment with what they want to say safely without retaliation. It also sometimes gives me insights into the other person's experience or position. And when I did this with Zainab playing the part of her mother, it was hard to hear what Zainab experienced, and I felt guilty and I wanted to defend myself. But it also made me curious about her mother's wider experience as a woman and not just as a mother. And I wondered with Zainab about her parents' marriage and if her mother's second marriage had been happy with her new husband. Zainab said that her father was always a very emotionally closed man and could not fulfill her mother in that relationship. In her second marriage, she had seemed closer to her husband, but Zainab then said they were never able to bring their families together because my mother couldn't accept his children and they never accepted her. Her new husband had died some years later of breast cancer that engulfed his heart. Zainab told me how she had hated him, but had gone to visit him when he was dying. She said it was strange because her mother's husband had cancer himself and never told anyone or sought treatment until it was too late. And yet he had gone out of his way to help her older sister get treatment for her breast cancer, which she had had around the same time as him. Her mum had been devastated by his death. I felt Zainab had just revealed something much more tender and a deeper multi-generational wound. She went on to tell me how she still sees him in her dreams. She had a recurring dream where he is standing in a graveyard holding a piece of paper, as if his medical records, and tells her, "The pain I went through, that was nothing." I wondered what this meant to her. She said she felt he was telling her that the pain he is in now is even worse, the pain of the hereafter. I asked her what she felt when she woke up from the dream.
So sorry to interrupt you, but we have a 2-minute inshallah mark here.
Oh, wow, okay. She said, "I feel like I need to do something for him," and her mother tells her to pray for him. I said, "What do you want to pray for him?" And she said, "For him not to suffer the punishment of the grave." I said, "Do you feel okay to ask for his forgiveness?" She had tears in her eyes and she said, "Yes." I said, "May Allah heal and forgive you all." So that's a snapshot of the session. And the points I really want to highlight from it is that by exploring teachings from Quranic, so first of all, actually, that often Islamic concepts such as heaven below a mother's feet, the other one that's come up recently is riba, that sometimes these things act as blocks and barriers to therapy because people are afraid of talking about things and whether this would be going against Islamic prescriptions. And reframing them can really be important in terms of helping people feel that they can open up. And doing this from within people's own cultural traditions and using images and metaphors from within their tradition can help them not feel that they're being forced into a split between a more westernized approach and an Islamic approach. And so I think this helped her open up and tell more of the story. Also, by drawing on Quranic teachings, and Quranic teachings are so rich with human understanding. And here, the story of Adam and Ebleese comes to me about making mistakes. And I don't usually bring up Quranic stories, but most of the times clients bring them up and then I explore them with them. But, this theme of making mistakes, I think, is so rife in our communities because I think culturally we've been conditioned to feel so shameful about making mistakes and afraid of God's punishment. But as my work with scholars kind of really helped me realize is that actually the point of the story is also that God forgives. So when Adam turns to God in sincere tawbah, he forgives. And, actually in terms of the divine attributes, it's really interesting because there are actually 3 names for forgiveness. And if I had time, I would say more about that. And the point really is that God manifests his rahmah through this. There's actually a very powerful hadith in which the Prophet, and it's narrated by Abu Huraira, where the Prophet says, if you did not sin, Allah would replace you with a people who would sin and they would seek his forgiveness and he would forgive them. So sometimes we actually learn through making mistakes and we actually become more conscious and more aware of the meaning of things. And for the philosopher Muhammad Iqbal, actually, the whole point of religion was consciousness raising. And so I think the Quranic stories offer us a way of understanding the human condition and also guiding us to Islamic virtues. The other dimension of the case, which I think is to do with an ethical approach, is that that the stories also guide us to what is righteous conduct. And my insight into her mother's experience with her second husband and inquiring about that really allowed another dimension of the story to come forward, which actually in that dream turned out to be about forgiveness. And dreams are really incredible. When you're working with clients, sometimes you feel like someone is so stuck in their suffering, and then they'll tell you a dream and something else is going on or trying to manifest through them. And so I had found that session with her really powerful. I know I don't have much time, but I'm literally going to just say a couple of words about each of these slides. The Quran encourages self-reflection, and it's the main reference point, not just for spiritual matters for people, but also for their mundane day-to-day lives. And you could even say the Quran gets enacted almost daily. Aspects of it, the stories get enacted daily within us and outside us. this is a controversial point because, you know, people often, when I've done this presentation, one of the issues that's come up is that, oh, this is doing tafsir of the Quran. And I really want to point out, I'm not doing tafsir. There are many different ways of approaching and studying the Quran. There's formal ways, which I have engaged in with scholars, but people also personally read the Quran and they self-reflect on it. And therapy for me is a safe place to explore those personal meanings. And there are, you know, and I think we're encouraged to do this because the Quran keeps telling us to do this. And, you know, on the one hand, the Quran is accessible to everybody and simple, and in other ways, it's actually infinitely complex. There's a wonderful series of lectures, if you get a chance to listen to, by Samir Mahmood on the Cambridge Muslim College website, in which he talks about Surah Kahf, and he goes through how to approach Quranic stories, which I found really incredible, because he points out that the root meaning of qasas, stories, is actually to trace in the footsteps, or it's mentioned in the meeting between Khidr and Moses in terms of retracing your footsteps. So actually, Quranic stories are ways of us tracing the footsteps of the prophets. And Samir makes this point that they don't just represent past events, because God is beyond time and space. And so we project ourselves onto the story, and the story also projects onto us. They act as mirrors for guiding us and lifting us out of the darkness. So in a sense, they're mythological, and they're important symbolic manifestations of a culture and a religion, and they can be read as a historical conscious instructions to right and wrong, which bind us to a group of people, but they also structure our thought and reflection and organize our inner and outer experiences. Within the stories, they're multifaceted and they're infinite number of meanings. And this is really important because, you know, people often think there's just one meaning or one truth in the stories, but actually they're multi-layered and there are many, many different interpretations. You know, and the story, I'll just finish off quickly, Rania, just another 1 minute, you know, and you can, and they're multifaceted. So we tend to focus on the prophet themselves, but actually all of the characters around the prophet are also incredibly significant and reflect aspects of our nafs. So in the story of Yusuf, his brothers, their jealousy, Yaqub's grief, all of that is part of human experience. And so Halima Krausen describes them as truth stories with moving images. I haven't got time to really go into the process of practice and the challenges that involves. I can direct you to a chapter I wrote for Carrie York Al-Karam's book on integrated Islamic psychotherapy, which has more details. But as you can see, there's a lot more that could be said, and there are so many incredible stories in the Quran, which have been such a valuable resource for me to really understand myself, as well as understand human beings and God's rahmah primarily. So thank you.
MashaAllah, thank you so much, Dr. Rabia. What a wonderful and insightful discussion on the development that you did with, you know, really integrating Islamic therapeutic interventions into your therapy practice, how you came to it, and then what you did. And I hope, inshallah, at the end, when we kind of have a panelist discussion, we're able to bring up some of these themes again. Many thanks to you, mashallah. Next up, inshallah, we have a discussion with Dr. Khalid Elzamzamy entitled Suicide and Islamic Religio-Psychological Synthesis, which I know many of us are looking forward to hearing as well. And a couple of words about who Dr. Khalid is. He is a psychiatry resident at the Hamad Medical Corporation in Qatar. He holds a master's degree in Islamic studies and serves as a research fellow for the Family Youth Institute in the USA. Khalid's interest includes ethics and clinical practice, the history of psychiatry, and the interplay between mental health, spirituality, and religiosity. So with that, inshallah, we welcome Dr. Khalid for his presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Rania. The greeting during COVID time has become, can you hear me, can you see me? So can you hear me, can you see me?
Yes, we can, mashallah.
Assalamu alaikum, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Rania. Thank you for the organizing committee for this opportunity. And thank you for everyone who's joining this session from your kitchen, from your dining room, living room, from your office. Thank you for joining us. So as Dr. Rania said, the topic is on suicide. I have no conflicts of interest to disclose. The topic of suicide does not need any introduction, but just to remind everyone about the impact, according to the World Health Organization in 2019, almost 800,000 people lose their lives to suicide. What I want to say in my introduction is that the topic of suicide is a sensitive topic, especially when we are talking about the relationship between religion, Islam, and suicide. And this is a work in progress for me. This is part of my master's thesis. So I welcome any feedback, advice, corrections, suggestions at the end, inshallah. So my research questions in my thesis have been, how has suicide been conceptualized? How has suicide been conceptualized? And I'm looking at two main discourses, the Islamic scholarly discourse and the mental health discourse. And I'm looking at three main domains here. How do Muslim scholars and mental health professionals explain the incidence and the existence of suicide and the nature of suicide, how they prevent suicide, and how do they discuss post-suicide issues? And I will focus in this presentation mainly on the post-suicide questions raised by Muslim scholars as well as mental health professionals. And by post-suicide issues, I want you to reflect on some of these questions. Who of you would hesitate to attend a janazah of a suicide victim? For imams here in the audience, would you lead the janazah prayer or not for a suicide victim? If a family member dies by suicide, would you tell people about the cause of death or not? Do you believe that a Muslim dying by suicide will be eternally punished in the hellfire? Right? So these are some of the questions that we come across post-suicide. So after reviewing the Islamic scholarly discourse and the mental health discourse, two main themes have emerged. Number one is the psychospiritual journey of healing for suicide survivors. And by suicide survivors here, just to clarify the terminology, I mean those who are left behind, not those who survived suicide attempts. The word suicide survivors refer to people who are left behind, families and friends of suicide victims. So one very significant domain post-suicide is that emotional and healing journey, the bereavement and the grieving of suicide survivors. And the main topics that are discussed are suicide bereavement, postvention efforts, and from the Islamic scholarly discourse, I will comment on Islamic grief literature. Now, the other theme that emerged from my survey of the literature and the discourse are theological and legal questions that pertain to suicide victims. And this is mainly around the theological status of the suicide victim, the person who dies by suicide, and the penal code. Are there any punishments in Islam for committing or attempting suicide, and the funeral rites of suicide victims? So let's just get into it, and I will discuss first the psychospiritual journey of suicide survivors from both the Islamic discourse and the mental health discourse. So each suicide victim leaves behind so many suicide survivors, whether it's family, it's friends, it's colleagues, it's teachers, students, therapists, and doctors, all of whom have to endure a journey of healing and recovery after suicide. Now, literature sometimes propose numbers for how many people are affected by each suicide. So for example, some literature suggests 6 people are affected by each suicide. Some literature suggests up to 60. And this brings the total number of suicide survivors globally to up to 50 million people affected by the 800,000 suicide cases every year. And these numbers are important so that we can cater services and therapy and support to these suicide survivors. Now, suicide bereavement, someone can argue that it's a death, it's a loss. So like all deaths and losses, there are universal feelings and emotions. So that's true. There are some universal feelings after every loss, such as sadness, sorrow, longing, and so on. But other types of losses and deaths carry more complicated reactions and emotions. For example, accidental losses and deaths in car accidents, for example, carry an additional layer of trauma and shock. For example, homicidal losses carry a reaction of feeling responsible towards perhaps feeling guilty that you could not protect your loved one. And then comes suicidal losses with more layers of feelings and emotions and reactions, which I'll discuss shortly. One of the very comprehensive works on this topic for anyone who wants to read further is this handbook by Jordan and McIntosh called Grief After Suicide. Now, suicide bereavement, as I said, there are multiple reactions that suicide survivors feel and go through. emotions towards oneself, anger, guilt, which is a very characteristic one after suicide, feelings of self-blame, responsibility, shock, hopelessness. There are reactions towards the deceased, like sense of abandonment and rejection, a sense of anger, search for meaning and relief. And there are some reactions towards the society, including a sense of shame and stigma, a sense of isolation, and the society can feel a sense of confusion and discomfort, how to address the family, how to support and help the survivors, right? So it really feels like a lonely journey of recovery. And some scholars have described what they call social ineptitude after suicide, where the community doesn't really know how to help and support the survivors, the family and the friends of the suicide victim. And they describe that people sometimes offer unhelpful advice. They tend to suddenly withdraw from the society, from the community. People fail to support when support is highly needed. Also, in the mainstream mental health literature, you would read a lot about the relationship between religion and grief post-suicide. And scholars talk about some of the questions that emerge regardless what religion or culture the person belongs to, questions about the fate of the suicide victim. Also, they describe how clergy play a significant role as first responders. They also say that the funeral, even after suicide, is extremely important as it provides a reality check point. Also, they describe it as the point where healing can actually begin. So all of this highlight the vulnerability of suicide survivors and the difficulty of this recovery journey. And that's why we find in the literature talk about postvention efforts. And by postvention, it means any efforts that or services that are provided to suicide survivors to help them in their recovery journey. And you will find talk about group support interventions and individual grief therapy. And individual grief therapy talks about coping, meaning making after suicide, emotional, cognitive, and behavioral work is involved. They talk about the mourning tasks. Some talk about spiritual integration in this process. Now, what does the Islamic literature tell us about bereavement and grief? And do we find anything in the Islamic literature about grief after suicide? Well, in the Islamic literature, as we heard in the first session today, there's a lot of, the Islamic intellectual heritage is very rich, and we find a whole genre in the literature on, they call it tasliya, for example, these titles here that you can see here, تسلية أهل المصاب, سلوة المحزون, برد الأكباد عند فقد الأولاد. These are all books around themes of comforting those who lost people, those who lost their kids, people who are going through trials and tribulations. This is a very, very rich genre. However, you won't find any specific mention of suicide loss and suicide survivors in these literature. There are some recent literature on grief from the Islamic perspective. These are some examples. And also, you won't find much mention of suicide and suicide survivors in this recent literature. Generally, this genre of Islamic literature talks about how loss and trials are inevitable, how these are opportunities for spiritual growth, the reward for patience, for example, how sadness and crying and so on are natural emotions. Ibn Abi Dunya, in his book called Worry and Sorrow, he emphasizes the importance of crying and releasing one's emotions and warning against suppressing such emotions. He talks about the reward of showing patience. They give examples from the lives of the prophets. For example, the Prophet Muhammad ﷺ has lost almost all his first-degree relatives during his life and how he coped and dealt with it. They talk about communal obligation, how we are supposed to offer funeral prayers and support families and friends when they lose loved ones. So this concludes the section on the emotional and spiritual journey, what the mental health discourse offers us and what the Islamic discourse offers us. And we can see here a window of opportunity where we see that there isn't much literature on Islamic models for grief and bereavement and grief therapy post-suicide. So this is for our Muslim mental health professionals out there, out here in the audience who can work on developing grief therapy models from an Islamic perspective catered towards suicide survivors. Now, this takes us to the second section here in the talk, which is the theological and legal domains in the post-suicide period. And this is a question that They say, what might you find at an English crossroads? And for anyone who has read about the history of suicide, you would find out that suicide victims used to be buried in crossroads or at crossroads because no one wanted to pay for the expenses of their burial, and they didn't want to bury them where the cemetery is. So they used to be buried at crossroads. And during the Middle Ages up until the 18th century, there were lots of punishment and punitive behaviors towards either the corpse of the suicide victim or the properties by confiscation of the suicide victim or deprivation from funeral rites, right? So what's the Islamic perspective on a post-suicide period? Now, I've surveyed for my thesis, I've surveyed almost 120 fatwas on suicide, as well as classical and contemporary works. And the main themes that appear are the theological status, penal code, and funeral rites. The theological status, just brief comments here, there is a consensus amongst Sunni theologians that suicide is a major sin. However, that suicide victims remain within the fold of Islam and they are not doomed to eternal punishment in hellfire. And the only exception to these main rulings here is in case of istihlal. Istihlal means if the suicide victim has considered suicide halal, basically denying that God has made it haram, that Allah has made it haram. In this case, there's a potential of considering this person outside of the fold of Islam. And also there's an exception here in terms of the opinion of the Mu'tazili theologians. They have a different opinion on this matter. Now, in terms of the penal code, it is considered a major sin and a violation, as we all know. However, is there a had, prescribed punishment? Is there a qisas, retaliatory punishment? Is there a ta'zir? These are the three levels of punishment in the Islamic law. Is there a blood money or an expiation, diya or kafara, that is mandated here? And there's an agreement amongst all Muslim scholars from all madhahib that there is no prescribed punishment, had, for attempting suicide. However, some scholars have said that the punishment for suicide, for attempting suicide, is basically ta'zir or discretionary punishment, which means it's left for the imam, for the qadi, for the judge to decide whether there's a punishment or not and what kind of punishment and so on. In the Islamic fiqh literature, the contemporary literature, they have proposed some nuanced approaches towards this question of punishment after suicide, suggesting things like mandating treatment, for example, and weighing the benefits and harms in imposing punishments on suicide attempters, and so on. Now, in terms of funeral rites, and it builds on the theological status, if the deceased, if the victim, the suicide victim, is considered Muslim, then the funeral rites ensue as follows. Imam al-Ramli, in his book, narrated a consensus from all Muslim scholars, saying that washing, shrouding, offering a funeral prayer, carrying the body to the grave, and burying are all furud kifaya, communal obligations by consensus, and this includes murderers and suicide victims. No? So if this is the consensus here, are there any differences among Muslim scholars or?
Sorry to interrupt you, Dr. Khalid. We have a 2-minute warning here.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rania. So there is one major difference amongst Muslim scholars in terms of offering the janazah. And the first opinion and the majority opinion is that everyone shall offer a janazah for a suicide victim, while there is an opinion that says that everyone can offer the janazah or shall offer the janazah except the imam. And here it does not refer specifically to the imam of the masjid, but rather the imam of the Muslim ummah or the imam of the Muslimin. And an opinion that says that there is no janazah for a suicide victim. The first opinion was by the Malikis, Shafi'is, and Hanafis. The Hanbali opinion was the middle one, and the no janazah opinion is reported on behalf of Imam al-Awza'i and Imam Abu Yusuf. Now, to conclude, to synthesize all of this and put it all together, we've realized the vulnerability and the bereavement and grieving journey of survivors and the importance of paying attention to this and the window of opportunity that we have as Muslim mental health professionals to develop frameworks to work with suicide survivors, to address the shame and the stigma and the social ineptitude and the questions that come after suicide. Now, in terms of the theological and the legal perspectives, from the fatwas I've reviewed, there seems to be a lack of public awareness of matters that seem to be of consensus amongst scholars. Lots of questions, are they Muslims or Kafirs? Lots of questions, can we make dua? Can we give sadaqah on their behalf? And so on, although some of these are matters of consensus. Now, some of us might argue that this is protective to have such beliefs and opinions out there, because it will protect people. If they think that someone who dies by suicide is a kafir, it will protect the community. Well, we have to also look at some of the potential harmful effects on suicide survivors and so on. So this needs a lot of studying and investigation. Empathy towards victims, and there's a hadith I want to refer everyone to try and go and read on. It's a hadith narrated by At-Tufayl in Sahih Muslim, narrating a story of a Sahabi who committed suicide and how the Prophet ﷺ reacted towards that. Consideration of the mental state of suicide victims impacted many of the contemporary fatwas, as well as some of the Hanbali insights on this matter. If we say that the Hanbalis have said that the Imam should not pray the janazah or lead the janazah, we have seen some of them, the biggest names in the Hanbali school. For example, this is narrated from Ibn Taymiyyah, that he says if the Imam decides to pray and ask Allah's forgiveness for the deceased, and there isn't a superior benefit in refraining, then it is better. And that is from the Hanbali school that suggested that the Imam should not pray. One last point here is that Imam Ibn Hazm invokes the sense of brotherhood and sisterhood, saying it's fard kifaya, saying these are our brothers and sisters, and saying that a sinful deceased is more in need for our dua and supplication than a righteous deceased. These are my references, and thank you so much. I look forward to your questions and suggestions and corrections, if any, inshallah.
Thank you very much, Dr. Khalid. I think that was very, very insightful. And I know that we've been communicating about this topic of suicide specifically from tying in the clinical understandings and the theological understandings. And I do hope that we'll have time at the end of this panel to be able to really think about this and how we're integrating Islamic therapeutic measures into working with those who are either suicidal or, as you mentioned, in the postvention with the community and family members who are grieving. Thank you so much again, Dr. Khalid. Inshallah, right now we're going to shift our attention to Dr. Abdallah, Dr. Abdallah Rothman, who we're excited to have also on board here. Inshallah, who's going to be sharing with us some of his work, and which is entitled Building an Islamic, okay, here we go. Conceptualizing Islamic Psychotherapy, a grounded theory study. And to tell you just a little bit about Dr. Rothman, whom you heard from before here, if I could pull this up really quickly. Forgive me, it seems when you pulled it up, it kind of disappeared. So here we go. Dr. Rothman is the founder of the Shifa Integrative Counseling and co-founder of the executive director of the International Association of Islamic Psychology. As you all know, this is one of the sponsors for this year's conference. He's also a licensed professional counselor and board certified registered art therapist, licensed in the US, currently living in the UAE. And he's earned a master's degree and Ph.D. in psychology. He's a student of Dr. Professor Malik Badri in Islamic psychology, and has also studied with other traditional Islamic scholars throughout the world. And has been a visiting professor of psychology in Zaim University in Istanbul, International University in Islamabad, and Nilain University in Khartoum. So with that, Dr. Abdallah, we welcome you for your talk.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Rania. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. I just want to start by apologizing for taking up more screen time. I know I gave a presentation earlier, and I'm only doing 2 because it was advised by Dr. Hooman, and so I took his guidance on this. Because there's a lot to present, like everybody I think feels, it's hard to fit into 15 minutes, so apologies for taking up more time. And mashallah, these two presentations are fantastic because it really highlights the unique, there's so many detailed places that we can start to build out an understanding of application in clinical approaches. So the Quranic stories is such a fantastic tool to use, as well as just understanding the fiqh perspectives of suicide and how that is so important in clinical work. So alhamdulillah, thanks for your input. So I want to, so for those of you who saw my presentation earlier, this is building on that. It's the second phase of that same study. So I won't bore you with some of the methodology things, but I'll just talk about the context of this particular phase of the study. It's talking about taking that theory and putting it into clinical approaches, developing practice, and presenting a new new diagram or model that is specific to clinical. And so the context of this part of the research is really, you know, a lack of clinical approaches that are really built on Islamic theory. A lot of times what we have is we're adapting what we've learned in the Western academia and trying to adapt it with Islamic principles rather than really understanding indigenous approaches. And there's this whole movement in psychology for indigenous psychologies. And so looking at this as what Islam has to offer in terms of an indigenous approach to clinical practice. Because as Dr. Rania was saying in her presentation this morning, these scholars are our righteous predecessors were not just talking about theory, they were talking about theory in practice. And because Islam is so holistic, you wouldn't really talk just about the anatomy of the soul without really understanding its application for the development of the soul. And so thinking about how we understand clinical therapy as the fruition of the Islamic knowledge because it's supposed to be guiding us towards development. And so thinking about those unique approaches. And so what the aims of this phase of the study was to take that foundational theoretical knowledge of the anatomy of the soul and develop it in clinical psychotherapy by looking at, so whereas before it was scholars, now looking at practitioners and identifying how different practitioners work with how they integrate the Islamic principles into their own work, because there's so many different ways to approach it. And because we haven't had an articulate model of how this is done, people sort of do it in their own ways. And so learning from what people have done and learning sort of how theory can inform it. And so it was the same method, grounded theory. I won't go into that. Inshallah, this is the process of it. But whereas phase one was the scholars, phase two was these clinical clinicians. And so what I found was that amongst these 18 clinicians, there was about 3 different categories of how people work. So some people were sort of taking their Western training and sort of on their own trying to improvise, putting Islamic principles into their practice because seeing the connection, and then some of that is working outside, but then being sort of innovative of how to integrate it. And some who were more intentionally sort of doing Islamically integrative psychotherapy with a rhyme and a reason and approach and sort of a methodology to it. And then there was very few of the participants who were actually, I would say, you know, really coming from almost traditional Islamic spiritual practice of this clinical practice, closer to what it would have looked like, but adapting it still to modern psychotherapy. And so it was building off of this model of the soul, which again is just a diagram representing really an integration of key concepts from the Islamic tradition, but then understanding, you know, this is understanding the anatomy of the soul. So now looking at clinic. And so I just recently published this paper just about a month ago. And this was the model that came out of it, is this iceberg model of Islamic psychotherapy. I'll put the link in the comments later for you to find the link to that. But so essentially what I found was in talking to these clinicians and then trying to understand, well, you know, what do you do? What is the work that you do from your, you know, all of them have Western training. And when we say Western, so here it says on this diagram, the Western model. Clearly, you know, there isn't a thing that exists called the Western model. It's not necessarily a monolith. There's lots of different approaches within the West. But surely there is a sort of most popular way of working that is primarily secular. And it is primarily, you know, as it shows here, sort of cognitive behavioral. So, you know, the nafs being the what presents as this self. So in the other model, we're talking about how from a secular perspective, we talk a lot about self and the identification of the self in psychology, and it being sort of this identification of the self as a separate being from birth until the present moment, without the notion of its connection to Allah from pre-existence and akhirah. And so taking just that experience of the self, understanding, well, where is it coming from? What are the behaviors that are presenting? And oftentimes this is what we're dealing with, is what is the experience the person is having, and then trying to deal with that sort of surface level or separated from that greater ontological positioning of the soul. And so this is why, in psychology, originally there was a lot of focus on behaviorism, and just trying to sort of negotiate the person's experience through changing their environment or changing stimulus. And this is often what's coming in and presenting problems is behavior patterns or a symptom of depression or anxiety. But then obviously, we know that these behaviors are connected to cognitions, and we hear a lot about cognitive behavioral therapy, which is dealing with the idea that behavior comes from cognition, which comes from some sort of emotion, and then so it's sort of following it down. And certainly the Islamic tradition has a cognitive behavioral approach before it was ever come up with in the West through Abu Zayd al-Balkhi from early on. And so this is a practice that is Islamic, and yet it is not. It would be one aspect of an Islamic approach. So what I found is that a lot of the clinicians who were trained in the West were much more comfortable using cognitive behavioral practices because that's what's more available for training. But then as people had more Islamic education and more, particularly even Islamic spirituality education, it was understanding these deeper levels of the self, of how to tap into them. And so going further down in this iceberg, getting deeper into the sort of unseen realm of the human being, where it's a little bit more murky and it's a little bit more uncomfortable, maybe even not only for the client, but for the clinician to know what they're working with or how to work with it, or even if they should be working with it, right? Because then you get into this realm, as you get deeper into these layers, you get into the realm of the spirit and this sort of notion that this is maybe beyond the realm of a practitioner who is trained, in this academic field or clinical field of psychology. And so what I discovered in working with these people is the amount that people were able to go deeper depended on their familiarity and education with Islamic education, Islamic knowledge, for understanding particularly the sort of depths of the soul. And so the idea is that the deeper down you go, the cognitions connect then to this getting to the qalb, right? And so if we understand that the center of the self from an Islamic perspective is in the qalb, is in the heart, so it's not just mental health. We're not talking about just changing thoughts in order to change behavior, but really that the core of the human being is there's this material that is can block somebody's access to their deeper spiritual reality in their ruh. And so what we're sort of deeper we go, or maybe even deeper into an explicitly Islamic approach, is uncovering these blockages in the heart to reveal this deeper aspect of the self in the ruh. And so you can follow it down by connecting to the qalb is an opening to connecting to this true nature, the fitra of the soul, or fitra of the ruh. And so what I found is that clinicians talked about different approaches to accessing these different levels. So there would be like nafs directives or approaches in psychotherapy, aql approaches, qalb approaches, and ruhani approaches. And ironically, people tend to be more comfortable with nafs and aql, obviously because This is what you have more training in from the West. But then a lot of people had more comfortable with like what they would call ruhani approaches. Why? Because we have direction in that from the tradition, from the Quran, like ibadah, reading Quran, making salat, doing these acts of ibadah are directives to access the spiritual state. But it was the area of the qalb where people had a lot less to understand really how to access that. And it was more the people who had training in Islamic spiritual sciences of understanding this, accessing the heart and accessing this deeper part. And so, whereas you may be able to not necessarily need to follow the nafs to the aql, to the qalb, because of the direct access, because Allah can create anything at any time, but also because we have these sort of cheat sheet through the ibadat assigned to us, is you can access the ruh oftentimes directly. But then the thing that really came out of what makes an Islamic approach unique is this idea that that we can have blockages in our heart that keep us from being in equilibrium or being in where the system is working. And that this is on a deeper than just a cognitive and emotional, but in the qalb. So if we go back to this, and we know that this purple area, the qalb, is sort of the mediation between the qalb being turned towards the nafs or turned towards the ruh. And it is the blockages in the heart from life experience, from psychological patterns that we get stuck in, where the light of Allah is occluded and we sort of cover over our truth, right? And we become stuck in this self, this separate self, or this delusion of separation from Allah. But if we can access this deeper part of the qalb, what potentially happens is this opening to the ruh, where the block can be actually removed and opened, and a person can access the ruh, which is always in us, this pure part of ourselves where we witness Allah, and we can come back into alignment with and receive actual transformation and healing. And this is what we know of when we talk about the tawfiq from Allah, and receiving illumination of the heart can be this deep level of healing on a soul level. And so it sort of, there's a lot more to be said about that, but I know I'm short on time. But essentially what this study showed is that there is a fundamentally unique aspect of an Islamic approach to psychotherapy, where it is about this sort of deeper level of transformation, and not just staying at the level of changing behavior, making somebody more comfortable in order to cope with difficulties, but actual transformation on a level where the person can sort of move through, not just cope with. And that another aspect of this is that there was a body. The body is really a part of, Islam is an embodied religion, and an Islamic approach to healing is really embodied. And so when we talk about connecting with the qalb, it's not just this theoretical qalb, but actually this place in the body, and being able to access it has a lot to do with being present in the body in order to come into a place of being and presence. I will, again, like I said, put the link to the article so you can read more about it, inshallah. But the implications for this are, again, starting to just think more. All of these things are to give more food for thought of how we can continue to develop it, and really to develop uniquely Islamic approaches. So not pasting on what we already know from different approaches and sort of Islamicizing it, but really looking at it from, what is the uniquely Islamic approach from the ground up of understanding the human being, understanding where we're going in treatment, and how to get there in terms of what our treatment goals are. And then sort of some of the limitations, obviously, of using this type of model in practice is the dilemma of, ethical violations in certain circumstances. There's a, difficulty of bringing such religious content, but oftentimes that has to do with where you're doing your practice. Is it in private practice or government? And then really, I'd say really importantly is the level of religious knowledge of the therapist. Obviously, to deal with deeper levels of work, you need to have a real grounding, not only in the knowledge, but in the practice of guiding someone, because you're sort of integrating spiritual guidance with clinical work. And this is something that I have actually another article coming out in the future, inshallah, about developing the scope of Islamic psychotherapy to understand where those lines are between spiritual guidance and professional clinical work. So I will end it there, and thank you so much for your time. And like I said, I'll put these links in the comments, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum assalam wa barakatuh. Thank you so much, Dr. Abdallah. Really appreciate that. And we're looking forward to discussing more, because the next topic we have actually ties directly to this. You presented more of the model and kind of where we're going. And Dr. Hooman, who's presenting next, along with Sara, Keshavarzi, they're presenting on the Khalil Center's new traditionally integrated, Islamically integrated psychotherapy model. So inshallah, we're really, these two talks, actually all four, but definitely these last two, kind of work right off of each other. So inshallah, let me tell you a little bit, probably many of you already know here, it doesn't need a lot of introduction, but Dr. Hooman Keshavarzi, who is the executive director and founder of the Khalil Center in the Chicago office, mashallah, he also is a doctorate of clinical psychology, and as somebody who has studied the traditional Islamic sciences as well, both privately, but also through Dar al-Qasim, which is in Chicago. And he, inshallah, along with Sara, who is a Ph.D. student at the University of Windsor, focusing on emotional focused psychotherapy, and also an intern at the Khalil Center, together, they're going to be presenting on Khalil Center's new TIIP model. Earlier today, we said that the Khalil Center has a new book coming out this summer specifically on this topic. So we're really excited to have you share this, Dr. Hooman. Welcome.
Jazakumullah khair. Thank you, Dr. Rania. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen wa afdal as-salati wa atammu at-taslim ala sayyidina Muhammad wa ala alihi wa ashabihi wa dhurriyyatihi wa man taba'ahum bi ihsanin ila yawm ad-din wa ba'd. So as Dr. Rania mentioned, and was also mentioned in the previous talk, this is on a segment of traditional Islamically integrated psychotherapy. So I'm just going to focus on one strand of traditional Islamically integrated psychotherapy. First off, just to qualify, what is traditional Islamically integrated psychotherapy? It is an Islamically integrated psychotherapy, and we put the T in front of it to qualify the type of Islam that we're referring to, because the tradition is many different approaches, and individuals may draw upon different sects, for example, or claim the usage of the word Islam. For example, you might have Shias, you might have other traditions. What we mean by traditional is that it is kind of oriented and situated within the Sunni Islamic intellectual heritage, just so people are aware of what that means. Now, the other thing I want to mention is, even within the Sunni tradition, Islam is not monolithic, meaning that the scholarly tradition is very broad, rich, and very diverse. And there's also an appreciation or understanding that the discussion, the discursive theologians, for example, agree that there is, for the most part, two parts of the human being. There's a soul and a body, okay? And many of them refer to this as the Latifa Rabbaniya. Now, what that soul looks like and how you qualify it, it's qalb, nafs, ruh, and all of these aspects, there's a great degree of discussion about, and there's also a great degree of speculation about. So, just as the Quran says that I've not given you knowledge of the ruh, of the soul, illa qalila, except for a little. And so we need to appreciate that that there's a great degree of diversity and overlap as well, of course. So you're going to see the fact that some of the things that I'm talking about overlaps greatly with Dr. Abdullah Rothman's model because obviously we're relying on similar sources. However, there's some divergence as well that's probably reflected in some of the different sources and approaches that we may have chosen to adopt in this framework. And so that's why we call it a TIIP. And in our book, you know, which I encourage you to get, we really spell this out. We talk about according to which theologians, which schools of thought, you know, which definitions we're utilizing in referring to our model. Now, you know, what does TIIP do? I mean, in essence, it answers a couple of core questions that a psychology or psychotherapy should address, which is the nature of the human being, the composition of the human psyche, what are the drives of the human being, how do we define health, how do we define pathology, the mechanisms of psychological change, and principles of healing. And so this is the book that's going to be out at the end of July. I encourage you all to pick it up and to really read it. Obviously, you know, 15-minute presentation isn't going to do justice to a very broad and diverse topic. So here's the framework. I mean, it looks there's a lot of similarity, right? Obviously, as I mentioned, to Dr. Rothman's. And here are some core things. And I'm just going to talk about one strand because I could take, you know, a very long time just on this chart here. So this is, you know, كل مولود يولد على الفطرة. Everybody's born upon the fitrah. We have a natural core inclination and goodness, right, which is important because, you know, different psychologies will have different philosophies about human nature. While we have this goodness, we also have these competing drives. And Dr. Rothman also spoke about some of these competing drives, the satanic or the aggressive and hedonistic aspects that kind of pull and work against the angelic parts of us that desire for metaphysical connection with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So there's this kind of, you know, وَنَفْسٍ وَمَا سَوَّاهَا فَأَلْهَمَهَا فُجُورَهَا وَتَقْوَاهَا. It has a capacity for good, it has a capacity for evil, the human being, the human self. And so it can go either way. And there's this tension, and that's why we often call this, you know, jihad and nafs kind of thing, where we're really competing with these two different parts of ourselves. And the goal, right, is to work on, right, these different aspects, right, of the heart, which is the aql, the mind, the ruh, the spirit, and the nafs. And this component, which is what I'm going to highlight, is ihsas. And ultimately what we want to do is to make a decision with each client as to which component of the human being we're going to work with. So somebody, and there's actually in the chapter, like, you know, markers, we say, for working with emotion. So somebody who is overly emotional, somebody who's not emotional enough, for example, these are components that may cue us to focus a little bit on emotion. Versus, you know, let's say the mind, right? We're starting to find a lot of cognitive fallacies or beliefs or irrational beliefs, right, that are informing their and shaping the way that they see the world, which then does what? All of these things are, by the way, interconnected, right? These are, by the way, each of these components, I say, like the scholars say, you know, some of the terminologies they might use is al-latifa rabbaniya. Why? Because al-latifa rabbaniya is more, it's sort of a subtle divine essence, meaning you have the body, and then you have this metaphysical entity. And they say it's the same reality, but it has different components, i'tibar, they say, like different manifestations. They're not discrete or separate things. They're just different manifestations of this metaphysical component of the self. What do we want to do? We want to work on these different components, but we want to listen with an ear to see which one or where the problem predominantly lies. Then we're going to go in and work on that. And ultimately what we are doing is going through these principles of change, right? To go from, you know, building this alliance to helping them uncover themselves, to then doing intervention, directive interventions, right? We go from helping them uncover and building the alliance to then having psychospiritual equilibrium across all of these states. And each of these states are going to impact each other, right? Negative thinking is going to impact your soul, is going to impact your emotions, is going to impact your behavior. You know, addictive behavior is going to impact your emotions, your soul, your thinking. They all have a circular impact, and ultimately they leave a stain, an effect on the heart. And so what we want to do is to work on them so that we can get to qalbun salim. يَوْمَ لَا يَنْفَعُ مَالٌ وَلَا بَنُونَ إِلَّا مَنْ أَتَى اللَّهَ بِقَلْبٍ سَلِيمٍ. That nothing will benefit us on that day except a sound heart. And so this is what we want to do. We want to do an i'tidal, balancing. Then we want to do an integration. Once we've balanced each of these components, we want to make sure that they work synergistically together. Now let's talk about emotion itself, okay? So I'm just focusing on, okay, now let's say we've identified that we want to work on somebody's emotion. Somebody you realize is emotionally dysregulated, imbalanced emotion. What we want to do is we're going to work emotionally with this individual. Now, what does that look like? Let's define and look at what emotion means. Now, comparing and contrasting this to emotion theories, there's kind of two major approaches what we see in mainstream behavioral sciences. We see emotion theory and emotion-focused psychotherapy, and then we see cognitive approaches to emotion. Emotion theory largely relies on James Lang theory, more bottom-up, precognitive biological cues that are then processed within the social context of the human being as a social animal, right? So thoughts kind of emerge later. Cognitive approaches focus on more of a top-down process, that your thinking impacts your emotions, either simultaneously, where you make an appraisal, right, of a particular thing in your environment, and then you feel that emotion, right? So I think about my finances, and therefore now I'm feeling anxious, right? Versus I feel anxious on the other side, and I don't know why I'm feeling anxious. I dig in, and then I realize and discover some things that are inherently kind of biologically driven as instincts that are bottom up. Okay, those are sort of two ways of looking at it. They often compete with each other, by the way. There's fierce tension, right, between cognitive theorists and emotion-focused therapists. In fact, even in the language that they use, they choose not to use one another's language so that they can make sure that they articulate very discrete phenomenons. I mean, I worked with one of my mentors in emotion-focused therapy, Dr. Goldman, for example, who would often correct any sort of CVT language that would be brought into her classroom or training. So we can see there's these two components. Now, what is the TIIP critique? So we're going to critique this. TIIP says that it's not just biological processes or cognitive, and that they don't need to fight with each other, but rather it's both and more, right? Meaning that emotions has a greater, we offer a greater differentiation of where emotions come from. We have multiple origins, and Dr. Rajab, who will talk tomorrow, talks a lot about multiplex ontology, multiplex epistemology. Islamic tradition, you often realize is not about this or that, but it's this and that and that. And they all fit in their appropriate place. What do I mean by that? Here's the model, okay? You take nafs, ruh, aql. Emotions can come from all three of these things. And let's differentiate. Let's take some concrete examples. And I know this is obviously, I don't have a whole lot of time. So nafs, we can have the nafs al-ammara, right? Or the nafs or ruh hayawani. These things are often interlocking and interchangeable, even though they're kind of on different components of the human soul or psyche, so to speak, and have different terminologies. They overlap a lot. That's why I've kind of put them together. So the nafs has a survival, two components. It has a desire for survival, right, through anger, right, which is aggressive drives, which is similar to thanatos of Freud. And then it has the kind of libido or the appetitive drives, okay? And these are not bad in and of themselves. They actually drive you to survive. So let's take some concrete examples. You get angry, right? Let's take anger. You get angry because somebody's attacking your family. That's a survival drive. It's an aggressive instinctual response in which you're going to stop somebody. So that emotion is coming from an instinctual biological drive for protection and preservation. Now let's compare that against a negative amara bisu, somebody who's overly indulgent or has untrained, untamed, overly active nafs. They haven't developed this nafs. What happens? They come home and there's no food, and so they get really angry that somebody has not provided them with their with lunch. Their spouse has not cooked lunch, for example, on their lunch break. That's anger that is not healthy. That's coming from more infantile, underdeveloped nafs al-ammara bis-su. Now let's move it up. Nafs al-lawama, a person moves up and says, you know what? There's this critic, and by the way, modern psychology doesn't really have a language for explaining the critic, which the Islamic tradition does, but they agree that it exists. And so your internal critic says to you, you didn't wake up for prayer. You need to get up. And you shame yourself and you get angry at yourself, okay? This is coming out of nafs al-ammara, or sorry, nafs al-lawama. Let's say contentment. You just prayed, it's the last 10 days of Ramadan, and you find that you are, engulfed in spiritual contentment, and a feeling of tranquility comes over you. That's at the level of nafs al-mutma'inna, or what we might call that drive for the ruh uluwi samawi. This is that growth-seeking kind of malakuti, angelic inclination. Another possibility, let's go to the aql. Aql khafi. This is the more subconscious or preconscious belief system. I feel angry, let's say, because women have treated me bad. Somebody has gotten divorced and somebody mistreated them. So now I see a woman, I get angry. I don't know why, but I've internalized negative beliefs about women, okay? Or aql jali, which is more conscience, and I tell somebody to think about consciously about injustice that has been done to them. Then what happens? They get angry. You see, all of these things come from different facets and components of the human being. But there's a very, very important component here, and that is that there's a recognition of a multiplicity and multiplexity and complexity of the human being that very much includes these theological notions that we believe that is consistent with what? An Islamic ontology, a conception of the human psyche, which is different than a CBT conception, different than an EFT conception. And so let me tell you real quick.
Dr. Hooman, there's a 2-minute warning here. Sorry, don't
okay, no worries, inshallah. I'm just going to wrap this up real quick, and I know I haven't given much time to Sarah. So what makes this different is that we can take chair work, we can adapt chair work, for example, into TIIP. But the difference is how you're going to conceptualize and understand your patient and how you utilize those interventions, even if you utilize similar interventions, right? So we can look at 3 levels of interventions in TIIP, 3 types of interventions. One is adaptations and reconceptualization of mainstream modalities. We can take chair work, for example. We have parallel interventions. They exist in Islamic psychology. They also exist in mainstream psychology. And then lastly, we have things that don't exist in mainstream psychology. And I know I've given very little time to Sara here. You want to go ahead and maybe talk about the emotional change process. Sara? I don't think we can hear you.
I'm not sure. I think our video is frozen.
I think we can hear, Sara, your voice is coming through, or your sound, but we can't see your video. Are you with us? Okay, in the interest of time, because I know we only have 2 minutes, we'll just leave this up here and maybe we can engage in a discussion. And during the discussion, maybe when Sara has her video and mic up, she might be able to speak to some of this if they come up in the form of questions.
Thank you, Dr. Hooman, and thank you for all of our presenters, Dr. Abdallah and Dr. Khalid, and also, mashallah, to Dr. Rabia. We're really excited to have had this opportunity to really think about and kind of wrapping up the panel, kind of drawing some of the threads together as we head into a few minutes for Q&A. You know, we've been really talking about what it means to take knowledge, psychology and actual psychological knowledge, and not just merely Islamicize it. I think this is the message that we've been saying throughout this entire panel, but rather, you know, really looking to integrate. That's a key word that's we've been hearing throughout the panel. We've also been hearing about going to the root, right, of Islamic roots to really either kind of build up from the ground up approach versus merely just sort of like Arabizing, Islamicizing certain terminology. And so with that, there's been a few questions that have come up, some specific to your work for each of you, and some that are more general. So I will start with the general and see where time takes us, inshallah, with the discussion. But first, we'll sort of see, there's 3 questions that I'm going to group into one and open up for the entire panel to really think about and reflect on. And they were early on, and they were talking about, okay, so we understand this concept of, you know, needing to have in-depth Islamic training, which is something that some of you have brought up in your discussions. But there's a question of, so for therapists that are going through their training, does it need to be in-depth Islamic training? That's first question. Connect that with the second question, which was, you know, well, if you have therapists with in-depth Islamic training, what about spiritual leaders? Do they need psychological training? So does it go both ways is another part of that question. And the third part, and I'm grouping this all together, what about the non-Muslim providers? Is the goal here to educate them in Islamic psychology, the way we might educate and benefit others with Islamic finance, let's say, that we say is applicable to everybody? Is Islamic psychology going to be applicable to everybody like that? Or do we need to have more Muslims heading into this field? And they are the only ones who can really do this work. So we'll open the panel here and see what you all have to contribute.
I would answer yes to all of those questions. I think we have to do it all. And I think for certain psychologists, Islamic psychologists or Muslim psychologists need a background in Islam. If you're going to be integrating Islam into your practice, you need to know what Islam says about the human being and how that informs working with people and understanding the sort of the sensitive nature of where and how to guide somebody, right? And similarly, I would say that goes the same for imams. I think it's problematic, actually, that imams don't have that training. And I think the fact that we question whether they need it is problematic. Because, you know, if you go back to our early scholars, like Dr. Rania, like you explained to us, they were, not only did they have understanding of psychology, they were masters of it all, really. They were polymaths. And, you know, to have the title of sheikh meant that you had mastered several branches of knowledge, not because they're different fields, they are integrated into understanding Islam. And so when we start to section out psychology as a side thing that's, you know, maybe it's necessary, maybe it's not, I think that's what needs to change. We need to understand that it's integrated into, you know, Islam, the teachings of Islam, the knowledge of Islam. Like if you get an ijazah in a book, the ultimate goal for that knowledge is for it to guide you somewhere and to develop your development as a soul and to illuminate the heart, not just to stay in up here. And I think as a community, as an ummah, we need to sort of move into understanding knowledge as something that's supposed to illuminate the heart, and that illuminating the heart is tied to what we're talking about here in terms of health and well-being, and whether we call that psychological health or whether we call it mental health, you know, it's a holistic picture. And so we need to have a holistic approach to knowledge from whatever angle we're coming from it, whether it's an imam, a psychologist, and yes, community members, I think, need to also be more aware of psychology and Islamic psychology, because if you're a human being, this relates to you.
I would echo what Dr. Rothman said, and just add just briefly that for those interested in actually a chapter that we both contributed to, Dr. Rothman and I, in the book, in chapter 2, there's actually a role of a TIIP psychotherapist, and it really lays out kind of a discussion of where to situate a psychotherapist within, say, the Islamic sciences or from an Islamic framework. There's also a list of competencies and curriculum or recommendations for areas and subject matters to really focus on and to develop in order to really be, obviously it's very aspirational. There's aspirational component, there's also more of the just kind of basics.
Thank you both for that. Dr. Rob, are you gonna say something? I think your mic isn't on though. Okay.
Okay, I think that's working now.
There you go.
Yeah, sorry, they wouldn't unmute me. So, yeah, I mean, I completely agree. I think we really need to study the Islamic sciences, and that actually you know, even, I mean, psychoanalysts had this idea that you couldn't do the work unless you knew the terrain. And I don't think I could do the work I have done unless I had really studied with Muslim scholars. And that was not just in terms of, you know, for me, it was an introduction to Islamic sciences, not in huge depth, but also there was a spiritual personal development, which I think was absolutely necessary to grasp some of this. And I actually think, you know, if we really want to be true to an Islamic ontological perspective, we have to be able to enter this other worldview, because so many of us are socialized into Eurocentric assumptions about the self, that's how we've come to experience ourselves. And really, it was only through my experience with scholars and them talking a language that sounded quite different, and all these questions that Abdallah and Hooman have been talking about what is the heart, what is aql, you know, I think some of us who've been in this area for some time have been really trying to translate these concepts in a way that doesn't create a category fallacy and does justice to the Islamic alternative notion of personhood. And so an in-depth study, I think, is really necessary, and it is an area of expertise, and I think that should be honored. And people are lucky now that these trainings are becoming available through IAIP. Al-Karam Institute is going to be doing some stuff, Khalil Center, books. So things are much more accessible, I think, going forward, inshallah.
Thank you all, mashallah. And I see that we're coming here close to the end of our time. And I think what I'm going to say kind of to wrap up, because there were some wonderful questions, and I hope that each of those who've asked questions on specific modalities that each of the presenters had, take the recommendation that Hamad and has told us about, which is basically message each of the you're all therapists, mashallah, each of the presenters on your specific app so that they can get answered. But to wrap up this panel, I think the takeaway really here is really thinking about, as we think about Islamic psychology going into the future, and the importance of grounding ourselves. So many of you are grad students or people who are still in, we're all kind of works in progress, but there's so many questions about specific courses, specific classes. How do I get this training? And in closing, since we won't have time to go back through and get all those recommendations, I will point you to the places in which these classes or courses are being offered. So Khalil Center has, and mashallah, has an actual clinical site in which these training, everyone who's there is dual trained and is getting that dual training in Islamic psychology. So that's one place to consider if you're a clinician and you want to really focus on this work. But the International Association of Islamic Psychology is also offering classes and online courses as well as those in person. And I think that's important to check out that site and see where those courses are and what kind of also practitioners. There's a map there, it's really wonderful, that you can look throughout the globe and actually see who is an Islamic psychology practitioner. Maybe there's somebody close to you in your neighborhood too to kind of connect with. And I think that's important point. And we have counterparts in the UK who have been doing some wonderful work as well on this topic. And then there's the books, the specific books, like Dr. Hooman mentioned, the TIIP model. And in that chapter kind of talks about what does a therapist need to really be able to practice Islamic psychology. That is actually outlined in the book, and that book comes out just later this month. So hopefully you'll all be able to have that information at the tip of your fingertips, inshallah, very soon. Barakallahu feekum. Inshallah, we're going to close out because we have other panels to get to. I hope, inshallah, this was informative. Lovely to spend time with all of you here. Barakallahu feekum, and we'll see you soon. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.